The weight of innovation. The workshop lights flickered against the February darkness as senior engineer Dmitry Volkov arrived at the Tula Arms factory. Snow crunched beneath his boots, each step echoing off the concrete walls of the facility that had become his second home over the past 8 months. Through the frosted windows, he could see the familiar silhouette hunched over the central workbench, Fyodor Vasilievich Tokarev, still there at 4 in the morning, hands trembling not from the Russian cold, but from exhaustion. Dmitry paused at the threshold, watching the old man's weathered fingers adjust a mechanism that gleamed dully under the harsh overhead bulbs. The SVT-40 prototype lay before Tokarev like a judgment, its semi-automatic action representing everything the Red Army's high command claimed they didn't need. Outside these walls, reports filtered in daily from the Karelian front. Finnish snipers were cutting down Soviet divisions with methodical precision, their bolt-action Mosin Nagants proving devastatingly effective in the frozen forests where visibility meant survival. Fyodor Vasilievich, you haven't slept again. The older man didn't look up, his fingers continuing their delicate work on the gas-operated system that had consumed his thoughts for 2 decades. Born in 1871 in the Cossack village of Igolikskaya, Tokarev had learned metalworking from necessity, not theory. His father's death had left young Fyodor responsible for maintaining everything metal that the harsh steppes could break: farm equipment, horseshoes, wagon wheels, and eventually in the Imperial Army, weapons that kept soldiers alive in remote garrisons. Sleep is a luxury, Dmitry. Every hour I waste, more boys die with rifles that take 3 seconds to cycle when they need to fire again in 1. Dmitry approached the workbench, noting the stack of field reports beside Tokarev's blueprints. Each document told the same story: Soviet forces advancing with equipment that proved maddeningly inadequate against an enemy that maximized every technological advantage. The political implications stung worse than the tactical ones. How could the world's first socialist state appear so backward compared to capitalist Finland? The crisis had been building since veterans returned from the Spanish Civil War. Soviet advisors brought troubling assessments of modern combat. Warfare now demanded faster rates of fire, quicker target acquisition, reduced reload times. While German engineers experimented with semi-automatic weapons and Americans refined their M1 Garand, the Red Army clung to the reliable but antiquated Mosin Nagant. Each bolt-action cycle meant precious seconds when soldiers couldn't return fire, seconds that accumulated into casualty reports that no patriotic speech could justify. The commissars still insist rapid fire breeds waste and cowardice, Dmitry said quietly, picking up one of the rejection letters that littered Tokarev's desk. The commissars have never heard a Finnish bullet whistle past their ears in a forest where every tree might hide death, Tokarev replied, finally looking up. His eyes held the particular fatigue of a man who had spent 30 years fighting not just technical problems, but institutional blindness. The Red Army's resistance to innovation ran deeper than mere conservatism. It stemmed from ideological orthodoxy, a fundamental belief that Soviet soldiers, properly trained in revolutionary fervor, needed only accurate single shots to triumph over bourgeois enemies. Semi-automatic fire, the generals argued, encouraged spray-and-pray tactics unsuitable for disciplined socialist warriors. Challenging this doctrine meant questioning the very nature of Soviet military superiority. From his coat pocket, Dmitry withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth, a metal cup his father had used during the revolution, dented but still functional. He set it beside the rifle prototype, a reminder of simpler tools from a more certain time. My father carried this through 3 campaigns. Simple, reliable, uncomplicated. Perhaps that's what they prefer. Weapons that embody revolutionary purity rather than this. Tokarev studied the cup for a moment, then returned to his work. The revolution had changed everything and nothing for him. The Tsarist regime that had barely noticed a peasant gunsmith gave way to Bolshevik leaders who proclaimed love for the working class while systematically ignoring input from actual workers. When Tokarev first submitted semi-automatic rifle designs in the 1920s, commissars praised his proletarian background while filing his blueprints away. Too complex, they said. Too expensive. Too foreign in concept. What happened in the next 7 minutes would quietly change both men's understanding of innovation under ideology. A messenger burst through the workshop doors, bringing orders that would either vindicate 3 decades of ridicule or confirm what Tokarev's superiors had always believed, that a simple gunsmith's son from the Don Cossack steppes had no business challenging Soviet military doctrine. Comrade Tokarev, the Finnish Demonstration Commission arrives at dawn. They want to see your weapon fire. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp. And stay with us for the next chapters. The pre-dawn darkness felt different that February morning, weighted with possibility and dread. Tokarev's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he prepared the SVT-40 for what might be its final test. Dmitri helped arrange the ammunition, each cartridge representing hours of metallurgical precision that the Red Army's procurement office insisted was wasteful luxury. Through the factory's eastern windows, they could see headlights approaching, the commission arriving to witness either breakthrough or failure. Marshal Kulik, responsible for artillery and small arms, had made his position clear in previous meetings. Semi-automatic rifles encouraged poor fire discipline and required manufacturing precision impossible to achieve under wartime conditions. The Mosin Nagant had served Russia through the Great War and the Revolution. It could serve the Soviet Union through whatever came next. "Tell me about your father again," Dmitri said, checking the rifle's action one final time. "You know the story. Died when I was 14. Left me responsible for everything that could break on our farm," Tokarev replied, his voice carrying the particular weariness of old grief. Plows, harnesses, the blacksmith tools he'd accumulated over 2 decades. No manuals, no formal training, just necessity and the knowledge that if something stayed broken, we didn't eat. The Imperial Army had been a natural transition. Young Fyodor gravitated toward armories, where his intuitive understanding of mechanical systems caught the attention of officers who needed weapons maintained in remote garrisons. But military service had also shown him the limitations of existing designs, bolt-action rifles that performed adequately in parade formations, but proved frustratingly slow in actual combat conditions. Dmitri pulled out the metal cup again, now filled with steaming tea that cut through the workshop's chill. The simple gesture felt almost ceremonial, sharing warmth while waiting for judgment. "The Spanish reports changed everything, didn't they?" Dmitri asked. Tokarev nodded grimly. Soviet pilots, tank crews and advisors had returned from Spain with sobering assessments of German and Italian equipment. More troubling, they brought stories of Republican fighters who captured semi-automatic weapons and used them to devastating effect in urban warfare. These reports couldn't be dismissed as capitalist propaganda. They came from loyal party members who had witnessed modern combat firsthand. The Commission's arrival interrupted their conversation. Through the frosted glass, they could see uniformed figures approaching, their breath visible in the frigid air. Among them walked Colonel Ivan Petrov, a veteran of the Finnish front, whose regiment had lost 40% of its strength in 3 weeks of fighting. His presence suggested this demonstration carried more weight than the usual bureaucratic theatre. "Comrades," Colonel Petrov said as the group entered, his voice carrying the particular authority of recent combat experience. "We need solutions, not theories. Show us what this weapon can do." The outdoor firing range had been prepared since midnight. Targets stood at varying distances, 50, 100 and 200 meters, representing the engagement ranges where Finnish snipers had proven most effective. The SVT-40's gas-operated system gleamed in the early light, its mechanism designed not for theoretical perfection, but for soldiers who understood machinery through necessity rather than training manuals. Tokarev approached the firing line with deliberate calm. This wasn't just about mechanical function, it was about validating 30 years of work that had been consistently dismissed as the obsessions of an aging Cossack who refused to accept modern military science. While his TT-33 pistol had gained acceptance, handguns apparently didn't threaten doctrinal purity the way rifles did. "Observe the rate of sustained fire," Tokarev said quietly, raising the weapon. What followed changed the Commission's understanding of infantry tactics. The SVT-40 performed flawlessly, rapid, accurate shots that would have required multiple soldiers with bolt-action rifles to achieve. Each round found its target with precision that suggested not just mechanical reliability, but fundamental improvements in combat effectiveness. Colonel Petrov studied the targets through field glasses, his expression shifting from skepticism to something approaching wonder. The implications were staggering. Infantry squads equipped with these weapons could maintain suppressive fire that was currently impossible with manual bolt-action systems. "How many can you produce?" he asked quietly. "That depends on how quickly doctrine adapts to reality," Tokarev replied. The Commission departed with promises of accelerated evaluation, but both Dmitry and Tokarev understood the broader challenge. Soviet military doctrine had to reconcile ideological purity with battlefield effectiveness, a balance that would determine whether innovation served revolution or threatened it. As they cleaned the weapon afterward, sharing tea from the dented cup, neither man spoke about what they both knew. This demonstration represented more than technical progress. It marked the Red Army's reluctant acknowledgement that ideology couldn't overcome ballistics when Soviet soldiers needed every advantage they could get. How do you measure the weight of innovation against the comfort of tradition? Spring arrived late to Tula in 1940, but the news from Finland came with the suddenness of a thaw. The Winter War had ended, but the lessons learned echoed through every corridor of the Red Army's command structure. Soviet forces had eventually overwhelmed Finnish resistance through sheer numbers, yet the cost had been staggering. Casualties that could have been reduced if infantry squads possessed faster rates of fire. Dmitry found Tokarev in the factory's archives, surrounded by decades of rejected proposals and filed blueprints. The old engineer was reading letters from field commanders, requests that had arrived too late to influence the Finnish campaign but might prevent similar disasters in future conflicts. "Listen to this one," Tokarev said, holding up a report from a regimental commander. "The enemy moved fast, fired accurately, and disappeared before our troops could respond effectively. We advanced with adequate equipment for theoretical warfare, but found ourselves maddeningly slow in actual combat." The letter had been written in March, just days before the ceasefire. It described exactly what Tokarev had predicted in his proposals from the 1920s. Warfare's evolution demanded weapons that accommodated human limitations while amplifying human strengths. A semi-automatic rifle didn't require superhuman marksmanship. It provided rapid follow-up shots that could mean survival in forest fighting, where visibility lasted only seconds. Dmitry's own correspondence had arrived that morning. A letter from his younger brother Alexei, stationed with an artillery unit near Leningrad. The war's end meant Alexei would return home, but his experiences highlighted the broader changes occurring throughout Soviet military thinking. "We heard stories about new weapons being tested in Tula," Alexei had written. "Equipment that might have saved lives if it had arrived 6 months earlier. The officers talk about lessons learned, but I wonder if we're learning them fast enough." The question haunted both engineers. How many Soviet soldiers had died carrying bolt-action rifles when semi-automatic weapons could have been available years earlier? How many battles might have unfolded differently if military doctrine had evolved with technology rather than against it. From his workbench drawer, Tokarev withdrew the metal cup that had become their informal ritual, sharing tea while discussing problems that had no easy answers. The cup's dented surface reflected the workshop lights, a reminder of simpler times when innovation didn't require navigating ideological minefields. "Your brother's letter raises important questions," Tokarev said, pouring tea from a thermos that had belonged to his father. "Innovation isn't just about creating better weapons, it's about understanding when doctrine must adapt to preserve the lives it's supposed to protect." The broader implications were becoming clear. The SVT-40's adoption represented more than technological advancement. It marked the Red Army's reluctant acknowledgement that rigid adherence to revolutionary purity could cost lives when facing enemies who embraced practical improvements. Semi-automatic fire provided crucial advantages in the rapid, brutal combat that characterized modern warfare. But acceptance came with moral complications. Dmitry studied intelligence reports spread across Tokarev's desk, assessments of German equipment development that suggested even greater challenges ahead. Wehrmacht engineers were experimenting with semi-automatic weapons and automatic rifles that might render the Mosin Nagant obsolete within months. "The commissars are beginning to understand," Dmitry observed, reviewing the latest procurement authorizations. "Production quotas for the SVT-40 have doubled since April." "Understanding and accepting aren't the same thing," Tokarev replied. "They approve the weapon because Finland proved its necessity, but they still view rapid fire as ideologically suspect, a compromise with bourgeois military thinking rather than an evolution of Soviet tactical doctrine." Their conversation was interrupted by factory sirens announcing the shift change. Workers streamed past the archives, their conversations mixing technical discussions with speculation about future assignments. The SVT-40's distinctive crack had become synonymous with Soviet technological advancement, yet its production remained limited by manufacturing complexities that would require months to resolve. That evening, as they walked home through Tula's industrial district, Dmitry carried the metal cup in his coat pocket. The simple object had become a talisman, a reminder that the most profound innovations often emerged from necessity rather than theory, from practical understanding rather than ideological purity. "If war comes again, will we be ready?" Dmitry asked. "We'll be more ready than we were 6 months ago," Tokarev replied. "Whether that's enough depends on how quickly our enemies learn their own lessons." "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. The future would test both their innovations and their courage in ways neither man could yet imagine. June 1941 brought news that transformed every conversation in the Tula arms factory from theoretical to urgent. German forces had crossed the Soviet border, and the weapons that had been tested in Finnish forests would now face examination in a conflict that dwarfed any previous European war. The distinctive crack of SVT-40 rifles began echoing from battlefields hundreds of kilometers away, carrying with it the vindication and terror that Fyodor Tokarev had lived with for decades. Dmitry arrived at the workshop to find his mentor studying production reports that told a complicated story. The semi-automatic rifles were performing exactly as designed, providing Soviet infantry with rapid, accurate fire that helped offset German tactical advantages in the war's opening weeks. Yet manufacturing remained limited by the precision requirements that Marshal Kulik had predicted would prove impossible under wartime conditions. "Listen to this field report," Tokarev said, adjusting his reading glasses with hands that trembled more noticeably than they had 6 months earlier. "A sergeant near Smolensk writes that his squad held a position for 4 hours using SVT-40s that would have been overrun in minutes with bolt-action rifles. Every extra shot meant the difference between holding ground and watching the Wehrmacht advance. The letter continued with technical observations that validated 30 years of design work. The rifle's gas-operated system proved more intuitive than manually operated bolts, especially for soldiers who understood machinery through necessity rather than formal training. Peasants and factory workers, men like Tokarev himself, adapted to semi-automatic fire more quickly than officers had expected. But vindication came, wrapped in anguish. Dmitri pulled the dented metal cup from his pocket, now bearing a small crack from being dropped during an air raid alarm the previous week. Even this simple object carried the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade, decisions about innovation and tradition that now played out in life-and-death encounters across the Western Soviet Union. "My brother's unit received SVT-40s last week," Dmitri said quietly, preparing tea with the ritualistic precision they had developed over months of shared conversations. His latest letter describes combat near Minsk. "The weapon's effectiveness exceeds expectations, but production cannot meet demand. Most squads still carry Mosin Nagants." Tokarev nodded grimly. The tragic irony wasn't lost on either man. The very manufacturing complexities that had been cited as arguments against the rifle's development now limited its availability when Soviet forces needed every advantage they could obtain. Ideology had delayed innovation, and now practical constraints prevented rapid deployment. Dr. Anna Volkova, the factory's medical officer, joined them for their evening tea. She had been treating workers injured in the accelerated production efforts, men and women pushing machinery beyond normal limits to produce weapons that might save lives at distant fronts. Her presence added moral weight to their technical discussions. "The workers ask questions I can't answer," she said, accepting tea in a standard factory mug since the ritual cup was reserved for Tokarev and Dmitri. "They want to know if their efforts matter, if the rifles they're building will reach soldiers in time to influence battles." "Every weapon matters," Tokarev replied. "But individual rifles don't win wars. Doctrine wins wars. Understanding wins wars. The willingness to adapt when reality contradicts theory wins wars." Dr. Volkova studied the SVT-40 prototype that still occupied Tokarev's workbench, its mechanism now familiar to workers throughout the factory. The weapon represented more than mechanical innovation. It embodied the intellectual courage required to challenge conventional wisdom when lives hung in the balance. How many soldiers might have survived if this weapon had been adopted 10 years earlier? She asked. It was the question that haunted Tokarev's sleep and sharpened his focus during 18-hour workdays. The answer existed in theoretical calculations that translated to human casualties, fathers who might have returned home, sons who might have grown to adulthood, brothers who might have lived to write letters about peacetime concerns instead of desperate battles in burning forests. "Innovation requires not just technical brilliance," Tokarev said finally, "but the courage to challenge authority when conventional wisdom fails practical tests. The SVT-40 succeeds because it accommodates human nature rather than fighting it. Semi-automatic fire doesn't demand perfect marksmanship. It provides second chances when first shots miss and enemies return fire." As evening deepened over Tula, production shifts continued around the clock. The factory's lights became a beacon of determined effort, each completed rifle representing hope that innovation might yet compensate for lost time. The distinctive sound of SVT-40 mechanisms being tested echoed through the night, a metallic rhythm that measured the distance between theoretical perfection and battlefield necessity. When Dmitri and Dr. Volkova departed, Tokarev remained at his workbench, surrounded by letters from soldiers who carried weapons born of his stubborn refusal to accept that ideology should override engineering. The metal cup sat beside new blueprints, designs for improvements that might save additional lives if the war continued longer than optimistic predictions suggested. Outside, air raid sirens tested their mechanical voices against the darkness, reminding everyone that innovation's ultimate test would come not in factory workshops, but in encounters where failure meant death and success meant the chance to fight another day. How do you carry the weight of decisions that might have saved lives if made years earlier? The summer of 1942 brought Dmitry Volkov a letter that would change everything he thought he knew about courage, innovation, and the price of being right too late. It arrived on a Tuesday morning when the Tula Arms factory hummed with 24-hour production schedules, each shift racing to manufacture weapons for an increasingly desperate front. His brother Alexei had been missing for 6 weeks following the retreat from Kharkov. Military communications mentioned scattered units, regrouping efforts, and tactical withdrawals, bureaucratic language that meant thousands of soldiers were either dead, captured, or lost somewhere in the vast territory now controlled by German forces. Tokarev found Dmitry sitting beside the workshop window, holding pages that had somehow reached Tula through channels neither official nor entirely reliable. The handwriting was unmistakably Alexei's, but the story it told challenged everything both brothers had believed about warfare, innovation, and the meaning of technical progress. "Read this part," Dmitry said, his voice carrying the particular strain of someone whose worldview was being reconstructed by unwelcome facts. The letter described Alexei's unit's final engagement, a rear-guard action that allowed other forces to withdraw across the Seversky Donets River. Equipped with SVT-40s, the squad had held positions for 3 hours against Wehrmacht infantry, supported by armored reconnaissance. The semi-automatic rifles performed exactly as designed, providing rapid, accurate fire that inflicted casualties no bolt-action weapon could have achieved. But the next paragraph revealed the war's moral complexity with devastating clarity. When ammunition ran low and withdrawal became impossible, Alexei's squad had surrendered to a German unit commanded by Obergefreiter Klaus Weber, a 23-year-old Austrian who had been conscripted into service he neither sought nor believed in. "Weber shared his ration bread with our wounded," Alexei wrote. "Not from military protocol, but from basic human decency. He spoke enough Russian to explain that his younger brother had died near Stalingrad, carrying a Karabiner 98K that couldn't match the rate of fire that killed him. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. German soldiers dying because their rifles were too slow, Soviet soldiers capturing superior weapons that arrived too late to prevent strategic disasters." Tokarev absorbed this information in silence, understanding its implications for everything he had devoted his career to achieving. The SVT-40's technical success couldn't compensate for systemic failures in doctrine, logistics, and strategic planning. Individual weapons, however innovative, remained tools whose effectiveness depended on larger questions of leadership, training, and national will. From the workshop drawer, Dmitry retrieved the metal cup that had become central to their conversations. The crack running along its side had worsened, making it unsuitable for hot liquids, but somehow more meaningful as a symbol of persistence despite damage. He set it on the workbench beside Alexei's letter, creating an informal shrine to the complexity of progress. Weber had studied engineering before the war. Dmitry continued reading. He understood mechanical systems well enough to appreciate the SVT-40's design innovations. During the 3 days before prisoner transportation, he asked technical questions about gas-operated mechanisms and production methods. Not from military intelligence requirements, but from genuine intellectual curiosity about solutions to problems his own country faced. The letter's most disturbing revelation concerned the Wehrmacht's assessment of Soviet small arms development. German intelligence had identified Tokarev by name, tracking his career from Imperial Army service through revolutionary periods to the present conflict. They understood that the SVT-40 represented more than incremental improvement. It embodied the Soviet Union's belated recognition that ideological purity couldn't overcome ballistics when lives hung in the balance. "What does this mean for our work?" Dmitry asked. "It means innovation carries responsibilities we never anticipated," Tokarev replied. Every improvement we develop will be studied, copied, and potentially turned against the soldiers we're trying to protect. Technical progress doesn't respect national boundaries or political beliefs. It flows toward anyone intelligent enough to recognize its value. Dr. Volkova arrived for the evening shift, immediately sensing the changed atmosphere in the workshop. She had been treating refugees from Western regions, people whose stories painted increasingly complicated pictures of warfare's human cost. Her medical training provided perspective on trauma that extended beyond physical injuries to encompass moral wounds that might never fully heal. "Your brother's letter troubles you," she observed, noting the careful way Dmitri handled the pages. "It changes how I understand innovation's purpose," he replied. "I believed we were developing weapons to protect Soviet soldiers, but innovation spreads regardless of our intentions. German engineers will study captured SVT-40s and develop improvements that might kill the very soldiers we hope to save." The revelation illuminated the terrible mathematics of technological competition. Every advance prompted counter-advances, creating cycles of innovation that served no ideology except the relentless logic of battlefield effectiveness. The SVT-40's success would inspire Germanic semi-automatic weapons that might prove even more effective against Soviet forces. That night, as production continued around the clock, Tokarev sat alone with the accumulated letters, reports, and technical documents that chronicled his life's work. The workshop lights cast harsh shadows across decades of blueprints, each design representing hopes that innovation might serve humanity's better impulses rather than its capacity for destruction. The metal cup sat empty beside Alexei's letter, its crack reflecting light in patterns that seemed to shift with changing perspectives. Innovation required not just technical brilliance, but wisdom to understand consequences that extended far beyond original intentions. In pursuing solutions to immediate problems, engineers might create larger difficulties that future generations would struggle to resolve. Tomorrow would bring new reports from distant battlefields, but tonight offered only the quiet recognition that being right carried burdens heavier than being wrong had ever imposed. When do the weapons we create to protect our people become instruments that threaten them? December 1943 brought the first letter from Alexei since his capture 18 months earlier. It arrived through Red Cross channels, heavily censored, but carrying news that Dmitri had almost stopped hoping to receive. His brother was alive, working in a German factory that produced mechanical components for civilian use, agricultural equipment that would help feed populations displaced by warfare. Tokarev read the letter twice before speaking. His health had deteriorated noticeably since autumn. The 18-hour workdays and constant pressure of wartime production had aged him beyond his 72 years. Yet his hands remained steady when working on mechanical problems, and his understanding of weapons design had only deepened through exposure to captured German equipment that Soviet forces recovered from battlefields. Alexei describes conversations with Klaus Weber, Dmitri said, sharing details that illuminated the war's human complexity. The Austrian engineer has become something like a friend, despite their circumstances. They discuss mechanical innovations and share stories about families they hope to see again when the conflict ends. The friendship between captor and prisoner revealed truths that propaganda from neither side acknowledged, that soldiers often had more in common with their enemies than with the political leaders who commanded their loyalty. Weber's technical curiosity about Soviet weapons design matched Alexei's interest in Germanic engineering approaches. Both men understood that innovation transcended national boundaries, creating intellectual connections that warfare couldn't entirely sever. Dr. Volkova joined them for their evening tea, now served in standard factory mugs since the metal cup had finally cracked beyond repair. Its destruction had felt almost ceremonial, the end of a ritual that had sustained them through the worst periods of uncertainty about Alexei's fate and the war's broader trajectory. "The factory receives new reports daily about SVT-40 performance," she said, reviewing medical records that track the correlation between weapon reliability and casualty rates. Soviet infantry units equipped with semi-automatic rifles suffer fewer losses than those still using bolt-action weapons. "Your innovations save lives, Fyodor Vasilievich." Tokarev nodded acknowledgement while studying blueprints for proposed improvements to existing designs. The war's lessons continued accumulating, field reports that suggested modifications to gas-operated systems, recommendations for simplified manufacturing processes, and observations about maintenance requirements under combat conditions. "Innovation never ends," he replied. "Each improvement reveals new problems that demand solutions. The SVT-40 succeeds because it accommodates human limitations, but those limitations evolve as warfare itself changes. Future conflicts will demand weapons we cannot yet imagine, created by engineers facing challenges we have never encountered." The conversation was interrupted by air raid sirens announcing another German bombing attempt against Tula's industrial facilities. As they moved to designated shelter areas, Dmitri reflected on the irony. Enemy aircraft attacking factories that produced weapons inspired partly by Germanic engineering excellence. Innovation served all sides in conflicts where political boundaries mattered less than technical competence. In the shelter, surrounded by workers who had spent months manufacturing instruments of warfare, Tokarev spoke about his father's death and the necessity that had shaped his entire career. Learning metalworking from practical requirements rather than theoretical training had provided insights that formal education might have obscured. The SVT-40's success stemmed from understanding soldiers' actual needs rather than doctrinal assumptions about their capabilities. "My father died before he could see what his lessons might produce," Tokarev said. "He taught me that broken things must be repaired, that necessity demands solutions regardless of their elegance or ideological purity. The SVT-40 exists because Soviet soldiers needed weapons that accommodated human nature instead of fighting it." When the all-clear sounded, they returned to workshops where production continued despite the interruption. The sight of completed rifles awaiting shipment to distant fronts reminded everyone that their work connected directly to life-and-death encounters they would never witness firsthand. Years later, when historians examined the Eastern Front's technical developments, they would recognize the SVT-40 as a pivotal innovation that helped Soviet forces maintain defensive capabilities during the war's most desperate periods. But in December 1943, its significance lay in smaller truths, that rapid follow-up shots could mean survival when first rounds missed their targets, that semi-automatic fire provided psychological advantages that transcended mere mechanical improvements. That evening, Dmitri walked home through streets where snow muffled the sounds of industrial production. In his coat pocket, he carried Alexei's letter and fragments of the metal cup that had witnessed so many conversations about innovation, ideology, and the price of being right when conventional wisdom proved inadequate. The cup's destruction had taught him something important about memory and continuity. Objects could be broken beyond repair, but the ideas they represented, the willingness to challenge authority when lives hung in the balance, the recognition that technical progress demanded moral courage, those concepts survived physical destruction and political upheaval. The SVT-40's distinctive crack would echo through battlefields for the remainder of the war, each shot representing Tokarev's refusal to accept that a simple gunsmith's son had no business challenging Soviet military doctrine. In the end, it wasn't the weapon that endured. It was the man who dared to imagine it, and the quiet recognition that innovation requires not just technical brilliance, but the courage to challenge conventional wisdom when human lives hang in the balance. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. The taste of shared tea and the memory of persistent innovation would outlast any individual weapon, reminding future generations that progress demands both intellectual honesty and moral courage.